Question is that, sorry, Senator Paterson.
Thank you, Madam Acting Deputy President. You are being just a bit too efficient there. I think there's a couple more speakers who wish to rise after me.
I didn't have any more on my list.
In contemplating my contribution to this debate, I carefully listened to the contributions of other senators. I listened to the contributions of my coalition colleagues, and in particular those who shared the harrowing stories and shocking examples of the misbehaviour of CFMEU officials targeted towards women, minorities, workers and public servants. I also listened to the contributions of the Greens, who, to their credit, have so far in this debate provided more senators to speak in defence of the government's actions in this area than the government has in their own defence, and of course the contribution from the sole Labor Speaker so far, Senator Sheldon. I wonder whether Senator Sheldon— well, thank you, Senator Watt, for that interjection. I look forward to further contributions from your colleagues. I wonder whether, in caucus this morning, whether Senator Sheldon drew the short straw and is their designated speaker for the day to come in and defend the indefensible, or whether he is the only one who has the courage to show up and defend the conduct of the CFMMEU. Because I sincerely try to put myself in the shoes of those opposite, many of whom ran, no doubt very sincerely committed to the advancement of women and minorities and defence of the rule of the law, and yet who will come into this place when this motion is put for a vote and dutifully do as they are told and defend conduct which surely even they know deep down is not right, is not okay, is not something that we should want to see in Australia. And I puzzle to myself, what is the possible reason why good people would come in and defend such reprehensible conduct? And I'm sorry, after reflecting and listening to the contributions of all senators, there really only is one possible contribution, and it is, as other senators have alluded to, ultimately all about money. The CFMEU is one of the Labor Party's most important financial benefactors. In the last 20 years alone, they have donated $16.3 million of their members' dues to the Labor Party. That's $16 million that's allowed the Labor Party to run and finance their campaigns and ultimately to prevail at the last federal election and to occupy the government benches. And maybe they can tell themselves, in the quiet of their room, in the dark of the night, when they're reflecting on their contribution to public life, that it might have been a bit uncomfortable to defend this reprehensible conduct, but it was worth it, because that $16 million allowed us to win the election and to be in government. I wish I could say that this was an isolated case. I wish I could say it was the only instance of the Labor Party making moral compromises for donations, but it's not. Because in just the first 100 days of this new government, they haven't done much. They haven't outlined a plan to address the cost of living crisis facing Australians. But one thing they've done very well, one thing they've done remarkably efficiently and productively, is to deliver for the constituencies who delivered for them, and particularly for their financial backers. Because this is in fact a pattern of behaviour, and we've seen it in the regulations issued recently to try to protect super funds from the measures of disclosure and transparency that the former government imposed upon them, and particularly the good work of Senator Hume, who was responsible minister in the previous parliament. All that we asked, which I don't think is an unreasonable thing, is that when they are donating their super members' money to causes, political and otherwise, that they disclose that to their members, that they be transparent about that to their members. And yet, in its first 100 days, this government has issued a regulation to try and obscure that information and hide it from those super fund members. The Assistant Treasurer, Mr Jones, has even laughably said that this is a red tape reduction measure, that this is about reducing the cost of compliance and the regulatory burden on super funds. He was very embarrassed when Michael Rodden at the Financial Review pointed out that other areas of the law, in particular reporting obligations to APRA, already requires super funds to provide this information. The only thing this regulation did was to make it public. But why would the Labor Party be so passionate about delivering for super funds by helping them to cover it up? Well, my colleague Senator Bragg, who I know is going to make a contribution shortly, has very deftly exposed over the last few months why that would be the case. Because in just one financial year alone, the most recent financial year for which we have data, 2020 to 2021, super funds paid $12.9 million to the union movement. And we know those funds don't just go from super funds to the union movement and stay there. They help subsidise the political campaigning activity of the union movement and ultimately the political donations that the union movement makes to the Labor Party. So this is yet another example of the Labor Party trading donations for regulatory favours when they get to government. And unfortunately, it is only one of many, because at 4:30 on Friday afternoon, it's always a bit of a giveaway when ministers issue a media release at that time, the Attorney-General, Mr Dreyfus, and again our favourite Assistant Treasurer, Mr Jones, issued a media release. The footy finals were on, people were heading away for the weekend, but just in time before journalists clocked off, they shared the news that they were also overturning regulations governing litigation funders and class actions. Now, brief recap of the history of this issue. It has become very clear in recent years that the conduct of class action law firms and litigation funders is under-regulated, and that the victims of that lack of regulation has been successful class action participants who banded together, finally had their day in court, won their case, and when it came time for the proceeds of that successful action to be handed out among those class action participants, they got cents on the dollar. And they got cents on the dollar because the overwhelming lion's share of those proceeds instead went to class action law firms and the litigation funders who finance their activities. Now, these are litigation funders who are typically located in tax haven jurisdictions like the Virgin or Jersey Islands or the Cayman Islands. These are litigation funders who are treating our justice system like it is a casino and generating returns on investment for their initial outlays of the many hundreds of percent. And in fact, it emerged during an inquiry which I chaired in the previous parliament that these funds are so oversubscribed that every time they advertise for an injection of new funds from overseas investors, they cannot meet the demand. And why wouldn't you, with such guaranteed lucrative returns through the Australian justice system? So quite reasonably, the former Treasurer, Josh Frydenberg, issued a regulation which required some very basic and very minimal compliance on the part of these litigation funders and class action law firms. One of the things it required of them was that they apply for and obtain an AFSL, an Australian Financial Services Licence. One of the key criteria of obtaining and holding an AFSL is it must conduct yourself honestly, efficiently and fairly. It remains an open question which one of those three criteria, honesty, efficiency or fairness, that litigation funders and class action law firms are unwilling or unable to comply with, and which one of those things this government, the Albanese government, thinks it is an unreasonable thing to require them of. Because these regulations, issued by Mr Dreyfus and Mr Jones, would have the effect of removing that requirement from class action law firms and their partners in the litigation funding industry. So why would it be that late on a Friday afternoon, within its first few months in office, one of the priorities of the Albanese government is to issue a regulation to remove a basic compliance and oversight of an unregulated industry? Well, to explain the answer to that question, I turn to Janet Albrighton and an article in the Australian newspaper published on the 16th of May 2020, in which she writes, "In the 2009-10 financial year, Maurice Blackburn donated $163,300 to Labor, then its highest donation on record to the party. The previous year, it sent only $12,951 Labor's way, and the year before that it was just $12,616. For the next 10 years, Maurice Blackburn donated more than $1 million to Labor, compared with $257,767 over the previous decade. In the last financial year, with the state election in Victoria in November 2018 and the federal election in the following May, Maurice Blackburn donated $354,805 to Labor, the firm's largest donation on record. It gave a further $200,000 to the ACTU, which campaigned for Labor." So that is just one class action law firm, and just one snapshot of the millions of dollars which flowed from this industry to the Labor Party. And it is the third example I cite today of major Labor Party donors getting regulatory favours from this government. And they are regulatory favours which help these organisations evade scrutiny, transparency, disclosure and oversight. Now, this is a political party, the Labor Party, which campaigned for office on being the most transparent government ever, on being an ethical government that was going to bring in a corruption commission. And yet, in its first 100 days in office, it is engaged in behaviour which I think is arguably corrupt. And I share Senator McGrath's advocacy that perhaps this is something that a future corruption commission should examine when it is established, because it is very hard to think of any other reason why the Labor Party would go to such lengths to expose itself to some political risk and some political damage in order to protect its friends, except for the very significant financial donations that they receive. And Senator Lambie made a good point in her contribution, a number of good points, but one in particular I want to highlight. She noted that the Albanese government wasn't proceeding on this issue by way of legislation, at least not for now. They're doing so by regulation. It's not a coincidence that in case of letting their friends in the super funds off the hook, they're also proceeding via regulation. And in letting their friends in the litigation funding movement and the class action law firms off the hook, they are also proceeding by way of regulation. Now, of course, regulation has an appropriate role in a Westminster system. Not everything needs to be specified in legislation, but it's generally regarded as a tool for less contentious areas of public policy, the rats and mice of public policy, the filling out the gaps of the legislative framework. But these are not rats and mice. These are not trivial things. These are three big substantive things. And yet this government does not have the courage of its convictions in bringing forward legislation to deal with any of these three issues, in testing the numbers in this chamber to see whether it could obtain 39 votes for these things, and exposing itself to a full and proper debate, a debate that would involve referrals to Senate committees, public hearings and inquiries and examination of this issue. They want to do it quick, they want to do it dirty, and they want to do it with the minimal scrutiny, because they know, ultimately, if exposed to the public, it would not reflect very well on them. Now, this is a new government. It is understandably riding high. The polls are strong. It's in a honeymoon period. But that does not last, let me tell you. No government enjoys that level of public support forever. And when the worm inevitably turns, as it will, in a few years' time, decisions like this will not stand the test of time. Decisions like this will look like a stain on the early record of this government. And I really urge those opposite to consider. I know it's hard. I know you're a member of the Labor Party. I know your caucus discipline and solidarity. But consider, is this what you got yourself in public life to do? Did you run for office to provide regulatory favours to your political donors? Because if the Liberal and National parties did these things in government, you would be the first people to charge into this chamber and accuse us of corrupt conduct and corrupt behaviour. And if you think it's bad if your political opponents do it, then you should reflect on whether it's okay for you to do it as well. You should reflect on whether that is really the purpose for which you came to the federal parliament, to represent your fellow Australians.